Welcome to the On the Move. Today we will talk about the growing normalization of the use of surveillance and AI technologies at European migration management. It is definitely not an area that I'm well versed in, so I'm really excited to have Petra Molnar with me today to better understand the European way of surveillance that is becoming a global blueprint to manage migration globally. Welcome, Petra. Thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you. Let me briefly introduce you to our audiences briefly. Petra is a lawyer and a researcher specializing in technology, migration, and human rights. And she's the associate director of the Refugee Law Lab at York University. She's currently working on a project looking at the impact of migration control technologies on the lives of people on the move. Her work has appeared in numerous academic publications and popular press, including the New York Times. Petra is also currently working on a book called Artificial Borders, AI Surveillance and Border Tech Experiments. I have a lot of questions, so I will go ahead and jump into it. We could say that there is this moral panic that constructs, in quote, armies of migrants rushing to Europe, which is almost never accurate. But it is used to justify militarization, aka defending of the borders, both the visible and the invisible ones, and massive spending on border security technologies. AI technologies such as lie detectors used on asylum seekers, air surveillance through drones and helicopters, sensors, thermal cameras, motion detectors, guns, more guards, sound cannons, walls, barbed wires, CCTV surveilled camps, like most of which I have no actually idea and understanding of how they work. But all of this spending also keeps Frontex in business and includes a large number of private companies, as you have written, with little or no regulation. So my first two questions for you are a little general. My first one is how are these borders, as we understand them in the traditional ways as well as in our everyday lives, are now being constructed, and what is the efficacy of such border regimes?
Really good questions to start off with. I think it's great to start from a broader perspective to try and get a sense of what the world looks like when it comes to the inclusion of new technologies at the border, and for a variety of purposes, like you said. I mean, it's also great that we can start off by pulling back and trying to understand some of the broader logics that are underpinning why we are seeing the rise of this tech. I mean, in my work, I look at what I sometimes call migration management technologies, this broader umbrella of a variety of different tech experiments that you mentioned already: drones, biometrics, AI lie detectors, automated decision-making in immigration and refugee applications. And really what we're seeing is a proliferation of this all around the world. And a lot of this technology starts off even before a person crosses a border. A lot of this is now manifesting in the surveillance of social media of people on the move, different types of biometrics used in humanitarian settings or refugee camps. And then, of course, along the border, the kind of most sharp manifestations of this are playing out, particularly in Europe, but also looking at the US-Mexico border too. This is where we're seeing surveillance, drones, different types of instrumentalization of people on the move at the Poland Belarusian border, for example. All different kind of tactics that states are able to say, we are feeling really anxious about migration. Let's turn towards new tools of surveillance to try and stop this. One thing that we're already also noticing is that with the use of new surveillance tech along the border, the kind of efficacy of sharpening the border and really turning towards border enforcement in different ways is changing. We really are witnessing, I think, an important moment in which states are able to really change the game when it comes to border enforcement and the types of tools that they're able to use and rely on. And what's really concerning, unfortunately, is that all of this is kind of happening in a free-for-all setup. We're seeing new and new experiments, new and new technologies kind of changing the border regime. It's really kind of changing the power dynamic between the state party and the people on the move, with very little oversight and accountability of it.
Yeah. That actually adds to literally kind of passes on to my second question, because as you say, these innovations in quote, I think I've read this from one of your texts or reports. These innovations are often justified under the guise of needing new tools to manage migration in novel ways. These technological experiments, you say, do not consider the profound human rights ramifications and real impacts on human lives. And I'm aware that most of the things that we talk today will refer to address this issue, but can you first give us the general framework of overview of what is the human rights impact of these new technologies?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the human rights framework is a useful way to try and talk about a scaffolding of responsibility. I mean, it's by no means perfect. And as I think you know, I'm a bit critical of kind of using human rights as a kind of a panacea for, talking about the ways that this is playing out on people's lives, because I think there's different ways of trying to understand what is happening. But it is still really useful, particularly when trying to push policymakers to think about what to do and how to regulate this tech. I mean, for me, as someone who fell into working on technology and surveillance a few years ago, about 4 years ago, I was immediately struck by how a lot of the conversation around rights and responsibility was centered on privacy and data protection. That was kind of the starting point for a lot of the conversations. And don't get me wrong, it's really important to talk about data and privacy and the kind of conversations that Europe has been leading on, in particular with the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR. But when you then start looking from a holistic human rights perspective, it's great that since then we've now been having more and more conversations also about other types of rights that are impacted. Equality and freedom from discrimination, for example, being one of the key ones. We know that technologies, facial recognition, AI, automated decision-making are not bias-free. They, in fact, replicate and create new biases and discrimination against particularly Black and Brown communities. You know, that facial recognition doesn't work as well on women and men. And again, the context, since we're talking about migration, is really, really important. We are already talking about a context with little oversight and accountability, opaque decision-making, a lot of discretion vested in immigration officers already before we even introduce tech into the mix. Yeah. And again, we need to have that kind of holistic human rights understanding to try and pull apart the way that this is kind of manifesting. And there's a host of other rights that we can talk about as well. Freedom of association and expression is engaged when we start monitoring people's social media usage, for example. Freedom of movement, obviously, as we're pushing people to take more dangerous routes along the Mediterranean or at the US-Mexico border. And then also there's a whole other set of rights that we can talk about, looking at, for example, administrative legal proceeding and expectations. So, what would a right to appeal look like? What does a reasonable decision maker look like? How can we meaningfully challenge mistakes that are made by an algorithm? And who actually is responsible when an algorithm or an AI decision-making system is used and a mistake is made? It's all these kind of foundational questions that need to be had in kind of concert with one another to really get at the kind of holistic understanding we need to have of how this technology is really impacting and often harming people.
Yeah, I mean, this makes me think like then the whole questioning of impartiality. Like I don't want to right now necessarily expand on this, but this whole, especially the last point you made in terms of the legal procedures, like how do you compete something that's designed and assumed to be impartial, for example? This is like, but there's a whole cultural context behind the production of these things, not just culture, gendered, racialized, all sorts of, parameters fall into feeding into. It's so frustrating. One thing I want to open a parenthesis is something that I don't know. What is automated decision making?
It's a good question. And, I think in this space, we throw terms around a lot, and I really struggle with it as well, because I'm, not a tech person by training. I come from refugee law and human rights law and anthropology. And a few years ago, I didn't really know what an algorithm was. So I've had to do a lot of learning about these terms. Automated decision-making is a class of technologies that uses a large data input set to make certain determinations in an automatic way, basically. So sometimes people talk about artificial intelligence or algorithmic decision-making, and it's all part of the same kind of idea that an algorithm or a system is like a recipe. It basically takes different ingredients and then spits out a result based on that set of ingredients. And we see this really playing out kind of across the migrations specter, but it's also, used in all sorts of other contexts as well. But the idea is that either a decision is partially or fully automated, sometimes with human oversight and sometimes without human oversight. So you can imagine that there are really kind of difficult human rights issues that kind of play into this when we talk about immigration.
Yeah, the phrase you used, spits out, is like literally is all telling in a sense. Okay, so the next question is a little bit on the newly constructed closed controlled camps on the hotspot islands in Greece. Lesbos, Kos, and Leros, Lesbos is not completed yet. Samos, Kos, and Leros are completed and opened recently. And these are by Greek authorities, and actually by the labels in front of their doors, are defined as closed and controlled centers. And we see the use of the tools that you have mentioned to control people, and particularly these are done with EU funding. Can you please tell a little bit, if I'm assuming you know, how these camps are being designed through technologies of surveillance?
Yeah, sure. And I've been lucky enough to visit 2 out of the 3 camps that have opened. So I was at the opening ceremony, so to speak, for the Samos camp in September, and we just went to the Cause opening a few weeks ago. And Leros opened on the same day. We're still actually expecting the other 2 to open sometime in 2022.
Sorry to interrupt, but have you been to the space that they are planning to do in Lesbos?
I sure have. The garbage dump. Yeah.
Yes, it is like you go for 30 minutes with almost nothing. Yeah. And then there's nothing in the surrounding to let our audiences know. And then like there's only rocks, horses, goats, and, literally horse shit, but there's nothing else next to the wasteland where they are planning to build. And I think the other camps are like remote places like this as well.
Yeah, they're definitely remote. I mean, some people have called it geographic segregation, right? Removing people from cities like Vathi on Samos, the main city, and moving the camp, about 10 kilometers away, up a winding road, up a hill, basically. It's really difficult for people to get back into the city and, for example, see their lawyers or friends or go for a walk by the sea. And the one on Cause is also remote. It's next to a little village called Pili, and it's not accessible either. I mean, that's kind of part of the logic, to make it more like a closed kind of prison type style of a camp. And that's immediately what you are struck with when you go inside these camps, or when you even around the gates. I mean, there's multiple layers of barbed wire. You can see different types of surveillance equipment, different cameras. We know that drones are flying over the camps, for example. There's turnstiles that deploy kind of a tap card system and fingerprinting to get in and out. This is, of course, done under the guise of security for the people who are in the camps. But the people I speak with and meet with liken it to a prison. Now, that's not to say, of course, that we're advocating for camps like the Moria camp that burned down last year, or even the camp in Vathi on Samos to stay the same, because they were not great places to live at all. They were really difficult, often violent, no running water, tent kind of cities. But it's really difficult when the alternative is a prison camp in the middle of nowhere. And what's really, really concerning is that those seem to be the 2 options that European Union policymakers are putting on the table. That's really concerning to me. And, when you look at these camps and when you're there and when you walk through, it really, you get that kind of stark visceral reaction that this is something controlled. I mean, closed and controlled centers, which actually is also quite fascinating. They are still called, or used to be called, the multi-purpose reception and identification centers. And then the terminology moved more towards closed controlled, even though the European Union kept saying in different press releases that, of course, they wouldn't be closed. And you guys are just fear-mongering. They are not prisons and all of that. But, it's semantics. We can discuss whether they are prisons or not. But when you're actually there, when you have to live there, or even when you visit as a human rights monitor or press, I mean, you are literally confronted with a major kind of sprawling prison system. The Samos camp is huge. I mean, it's massive. It's kind of in a valley. It's full of barbed wire, like I said. It's difficult to get around. It's extremely concrete heavy. There's very few plants. There's a playground, but also behind barbed wire. So you really, really see this kind of manifestation of an increasingly sharp, violent choices that are being made at the Brussels level. Money then trickles down, and then that's why these kind of camps are able to open. It's really quite depressing to be there and to witness it.
Yeah. And Amnesty International recently published a report, or like a brief, on Samos camp, that some of the residents, quite a large number of them, because they don't have valid IDs as claimed by the authorities, since November 17, they are not allowed to exit the camp. And the people that Amnesty have spoken to noted that although you say, as I agree, we don't want to go back to Vafe, or we don't want to go back to Moria, obviously, but people had some form of autonomy in those spaces where they were able to invent some resilience. Here, they claim that they feel much more imprisoned because they cannot leave. And this has, especially with Corona, this has been going on for different excuses for 2 years now at the moment.
Yeah, that's right. And it's great that you bring up Corona, because it was such a stark example of different states being able to use this pandemic emergency to close camps, to make, camps not accessible to press or to human rights lawyers. And again, under the guise of protecting refugees from, outsiders, and protecting their privacy is another kind of argument that we hear a lot about. But it's really fascinating that that's the kind of choice of terminology that's being made, when really nothing could be further from the truth. When you are in those camps, you really see the kind of decisions that are made, and the fact that they render a whole group of people kind of, behind barbed wire, behind turnstiles, not able to leave, like in the Samos example. Yeah, it's really very sad.
Yeah, and also like I can't wrap my head around of like how the Greek authorities or EU authorities, to begin with, can justify, for example, the use of sound cannons at the land borders, or drones flying over these new camps over people who have just fled a war. I mean, human rights groups have, for the last few years, have been, particularly MSF, has been warning of the alarming situation of the mental health care of the residents living in these environments, especially about children. And usually the children is supposed to be the red line of people, but when it comes to these technologies or camps, nobody seems to really see this, the effects of these constructed environments from people who have escaped, particularly those conditions.
For sure. I think this also goes back to kind of where we started our conversation, looking at the broader logics that underpin and kind of legitimize the way that the EU is able to push certain policies forward. I mean, if you go back to a lot of the legislative documents, a lot of the policy conversations that are being had, the new migration pact that was released last year, right after the fire in Moria, it's replete with mentions of border enforcement, new funding for Frontex, something called the Europeanized returns process, deportation, funding of new camps. Again, I think it's this normalization of the kind of conversations that we're allowed to have. And then it becomes almost inevitable that, of course, we're going to be building prison camps. Of course, we're going to have drones flying over, because these people are a threat to national security. They're a threat to, quote unquote, the European way of life. I mean, that's literally the name of one of the ministries, or, at the European Commission. It doesn't get much more explicit than that. It's really, really clear that this is kind of a regional nation-building project of exclusion, where entire swaths of the world are really kept out. And I think Europe in particular is at the forefront of a lot of these really problematic conversations.
Yeah. I'll come to this lie detection issue. EDRI, I think, yesterday stated in court, the Court of Justice of the European Union has ruled that the European Commission must reveal initially withheld documents relating to the controversial border control project, which experimented with risky biometric lie detection systems at EU borders. And it continued saying, however, the judgment continued to safeguard some of the commercial interests of the border control, despite being an EU-funded migration technology with implications for the protection of people's rights. So what is this lie detection system, and why is it brought to court?
For me, this is one of the most kind of visceral examples of kind of border tech experiments. It's essentially, so the iBorder Control project is a Horizon 2020 funded project, an EU funded project, which is really important here. And it essentially purported to be able to tell whether somebody is lying at the border based on micro expressions and facial recognition technology. And it was a pilot project that was supposed to run in Latvia, Hungary, and Greece. Again, major interdiction points for a lot of people crossing into Europe. So none of this is accidental. And, you know, for me, I think we can tease this apart from multiple different perspectives. I mean, starting off with the fact that we know that lie detectors, you know, like the traditional ones that like go like this, that we see on CSI and TV, they don't work often, and they're not even admissible in courts of law in a variety of jurisdictions. So we know that lie detectors are oftentimes more snake oil than not. So it's fascinating that we are now turning towards AI or artificial intelligence-based lie detection. Why is it happening at the border? I mean, because again, the border is a testing ground for a lot of different technologies that are unregulated. And you know, when I put on my refugee lawyer hat, when I hear about an AI lie detector at the border, I mean, it immediately makes me think about all the discrimination and equality rights that are implicated in a system like this. I mean, how can an AI lie detector, you know, deal with differences in cross-cultural communication, for example? I mean, I've represented people, women in particular, who might not feel comfortable making direct eye contact with a decision maker of the opposite gender due to cultural reasons or, you know, sometimes trauma. So how can an AI lie detector account for this if it's taking micro expressions based on our face? Or even, yeah, more subtly, perhaps, the impact of trauma on memory. And the fact that we know that we don't talk about our stories in a linear way, particularly really traumatic things that have happened to us that we might have to disclose at the border. But again, for me, this iBorder Control project in particular really highlights the kind of logic or the impetus that states and you know, research projects like this, for example, are turning towards, that it's somehow okay to experiment at the border, again, under the guise of national security and border enforcement. I mean, how would we feel if all of a sudden we brought in an AI lie detector to, I don't know, the chambers in Brussels, or a business meeting where, you know, powerful private sector actors are involved? So there's very clear priorities in the way that these projects are developed and deployed.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just imagining how if it used on the EPs in Brussels, that would be quite interesting.
Maybe we should do that as kind of like an action, you know?
That sounds like a great idea. I actually would have a lot of fun with it. But like, how does this, I mean, I assume you know a little bit of how this functions. Like, how is it, like, is this used in the, you know, interview processes? And like, usually the interview processes also work with translators. So the people are talking to, like, how does it even function?
Well, that's the thing. And a lot of it wasn't transparent or clear. And that's why this court case kind of came out, because an MEP by the name of Patrick Breyer was really incensed by this, as were a lot of people actually when it finally hit the media. He filed this lawsuit to try and get access to some of the documents. And the case, you know, that you mentioned that just came out yesterday, you know, some of us have called it kind of a partial victory, because the court did side with Mr. Breyer and said, okay, you know, some documents have to be released. But again, it didn't go as far as condemning the technology or even make a judgment about the kind of public interest in knowing about really high risk damaging border tech like this. So it's a very, very kind of narrow ruling that could have gone much further. But again, the way this works, a lot of it is, you know, done behind closed doors, and it's really uncertain how, you know, facial recognition, biometric type emotion recognition actually works in these instances. But what we do know is that facial recognition is incredibly discriminatory and biased, particularly against Black and brown faces, against women, and especially in a high-risk, opaque, discretionary context like the border. I mean, it's already rife with all sorts of problematic decisions when humans make the decisions. So you can imagine what happens when an AI-type system is introduced into the mix.
Yeah, with those biases. Yeah.
Exactly.
So in that sense, again, ties to my next question, is the primary purpose of these technologies used in migration management is obviously to track, to identify, and to control these people who are on the move, crossing the borders. The data gathering in the development of these technologies, as you say, remains opaque. But they, include expansion of existing mass-scale databases, and that underpins, as you've also put in your work, these practices to sensitive data, especially biometrics. But the other day I was giving a talk, and I was, referring actually to your work, and some people asked me a very plain question that I actually didn't think before as well. What are the implications of these, tools, in that sense that how is the data preserved? Who keeps that data? Who has access to that data? Like, where is this cloud that these things are stored?
It's a really good question. And I think it really goes to also a deeper question, like the politics of data collection, data retention, data sharing. And, the fact that, again, we are in a very unequal world where states or international organizations in the refugee kind of protection sector are able to collect vast amounts of data on people on the move, on refugees and asylum seekers. But then what happens with the data? A lot of this is unregulated. Under the European law system, for example, we have the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which is a really strict kind of understanding of personal data and what to do with it and what data controllers have to do. But when you're talking about a space like a refugee camp, which might or might not be managed by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, UNHCR, or the International Organization on Migration, IOM, or a mix of that plus a state party, or maybe a party that's not even, signatory to the Refugee Convention, it's very much a regulatory free-for-all when it comes to data. And unfortunately, we've already seen how far-reaching data breaches can be. For example, earlier this year, Human Rights Watch put out a press release basically corroborating the fact that UNHCR had shared a bunch of data from Rohingya refugees with Myanmar. Whether it was, accidental or on purpose remains to be seen. But, even if it was completely accidental, it's really problematic that so much data is being collected, and an international entity like the UNHCR doesn't really have an integrated system of, checks and balances to ensure that this doesn't happen. And even, for example, with, the fall of Kabul and the situation in Afghanistan, so many biometric kind of data sets were shared with the Taliban, partly just out of kind of negligence when everyone was leaving the country.
Yeah, and when Biden was questioned about the kind of lists, for example, with the Taliban, he couldn't even answer, or he couldn't even defend the situation. It was completely outrageous, definitely. And on another end, I want to also, as you know, I'm interested in how these borderlands are also changing inwards. So do you have any knowledge or kind of experience in how these border technologies that are practically at the borderlands are affecting the local communities? How local communities are also negotiating these things in terms of technology?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really useful to not just look at the ways that this is playing out at the border or on communities on the move, but how it kind of normalizes the turn towards surveillance or the turn towards automation in a variety of state processes. I mean, we're seeing kind of automated decision-making algorithms make their way into all sorts of different ways that the state is able to kind of administer its services across the board and globally speaking, as more and more governments really are keen to automate a variety of their departments and the ways that they kind of deal with people and rights holders and all of that. So really, it's not just a question about what's happening at the border or in a refugee camp, but rather, how is our relationship with the state changing, and what can we do about even sometimes being aware of what is happening? Because the transparency piece is really, really important. It's one thing to try and figure out what's happening at the border and in immigration, but it's another thing to try and see how kind of our daily life is being impacted by a turn to surveillance and automation. Because a lot of this happens behind closed doors. And it's not until after the fact, maybe there's a huge rights infringement or somebody finds out by accident that a state has been using, facial recognition in policing or, welfare algorithms, like a successful court case that challenged that in the Netherlands recently. You know, a lot of it just happens on an ad hoc basis. We just are not as tapped into state processes when it comes to tech innovation as we should be.
And also, I mean, in a sense, in Greece, we see this, for example, in the increased surveillance of journalists, for example, as the Solomon team have seen in the last couple weeks. And the more I talk to some of the journalists within Greece, I hear resembling conversations from Turkey, like, hey, authorities, while you're listening. So we're talking about this because there's this now growing sense among the journalists in Greece as well that their phones are being tapped. Or, if you visit certain areas in solidarity with people on the move and so on, there is an increased monitoring and control of foreigners, such as ourselves, who visit these places. So it's very visibly increasing. But I think I'm interested also. Maybe we'll talk about these things in another time. But like how the local communities within these areas are responding to this. In Poland, for example, recently, we've seen mixed responses, right? Some of them are very much pro of what's happening on the ground. Some of them are establishing their own innovations, basically, to signal and support each other. So that is one of the things that I want to see how it proceeds. I'll go back to the globalization of this whole mess in a sense. So recently, I think it was in Washington Post, a piece came out on Biden's immigration advisors discussing proposals to set up a European-style reception centers along the U.S.-Mexico border that would transfer asylum seekers, that will transform the way the asylum seekers are processed and potentially curb the large-scale release of migrants into the United States. The paper put it this way. So my question would be like, how the EU systems are being translated globally. And what does this tell us about the EU actually? Because for me, when I read about these things, as I'm completely like, these are very new to me. And from a human rights perspective, however, we might challenge that as well. This whole thing reminds me of the arms control treaty mobilizations. The long years of human rights organizations work about the unregulated flows of arms that are facilitated across the world. So to me, EU is not just arming the conflicts, but also arming against the people who are running away from those areas through similar technologies, and in thus making this a whole global market with fairs and all sorts of capitalized systems. I'm talking too much about something that I don't know, so it's risky, but this is seriously scary to me. So I want to see, because I know you've been to all these fairs, I know you're also interested in the US-Mexico border. I'd like to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's such an important piece to this, the fact that this is a global phenomenon and countries and regions learn from one another and share tools. And I think this is the thing with surveillance tech in particular, it slips across borders really easily. You might have a set of tools and tech developed in one country, sold to a second country, repurposed in a third country. And again, in this kind of regulatory free-for-all that we're talking about. And the US-Mexico border example, I mean, is a really visceral key one, I think. And then the piece that you mentioned in the Washington Post, I think, did a great job of kind of linking, the impetus of the Biden administration to learn from the European model of prison-like camps or refugee warehousing or whatever term you want to use. But again, it's not new, right? Like the Biden administration has been making really clear that they want to move away from the kind of Trumpian physical wall set up more towards smart borders again, like was done under Obama, under the guise of this seeming like a softer, maybe kinder way of manage your borders. But, nothing could be further from the truth. If anything, we're talking about the border becoming more elastic, of kind of opening up the border space. And there has been some really great work done in the United States by a group of anthropologists and lawyers documenting, for example, the increase in number of deaths as a result of smart border technologies. Because just because you have a smart border and drones and thermal cameras and like a concretization of the border space, it doesn't mean that people are going to stop coming. They're just going to take more dangerous routes. And unfortunately, this will lead to loss of life. Yeah. And the other point that you were talking about, the kind of introduction of the militarization of borders and the kind of way that private sector actors are able to make incursions into the space is really, really key. And you're right, I did attend a number of these kind of fairs or conferences like the World Border Security Congress earlier this year. And it was just fascinating because it was essentially just like a free-for-all, a show of wares and, tech and toys and drones and all sorts of things out there. And really the conflation between national security and border enforcement and management of migration could not have been more clear. Yeah. But what for me is really disturbing, again, is the kind of growing role of the private sector in all of this, both in terms of kind of development and deployment of the tech, but perhaps more interestingly, from a philosophical perspective, also the setting of expectations and priorities. Because whose priorities really matter in all of this? Is it, the people who are at the border and experiencing the sharpest manifestations of the tech, or is it the private sector? I think there's a real reason why we're developing AI lie detectors to use against refugees and not using AI to root out racist border guards, for example. Yeah. That to me it's a clear priority that the private sector is able to set. And why? Because the kind of growing border industrial complex is very, very lucrative. There's a lot of money to be made in the border enforcement regime that is currently in vogue all around the world.
Yeah, exactly. So what you said, I think it needs to be underlined, maybe a little bit more expanded, is that how actually both EU and private companies choose using these AI technologies to monitor and control people on the move, or other direct racialized bodies, rather than as preventive tools to prevent human rights violations. So I think that's definitely worth underlining.
Definitely. And I mean, I think it's also a good reminder to think about these issues from a historical perspective, because sometimes it can seem like, oh, wow, we're talking about surveillance, new tech, it's this shiny new lens through which to analyze migration and human rights issues. But really, it's not new. It's maybe a different perspective or a different opening on which to kind of look at some of these issues through. But really, at the end of the day, we're talking about racial oppression that's been with us for decades, centuries. Certain communities made marginalized and vulnerable explicitly and excluded from conversations, over-surveilled. None of this is kind of new, right? It's just the state now has different tools maybe to use, whether you're looking at AI or drones or thermal cameras or what have you. But the underpinning logic is a logic of exclusion and a logic of violent borders. And the fact that the nation state can decide who is allowed to enter or leave. And again, it all maps onto lines of privilege and power. And for me, that's ultimately what this work is about. It's not about tech. It's about power. It's about who gets to participate in conversations and why we are able to kind of skip over some really, really difficult conversations that we need to be having. Why are we even introducing this tech in the first place? It seems like an inevitable thing now. And we're talking about regulation and safeguarding and all of that. But why are we even okay with a violent border regime in the first place? Well, because it keeps the status quo in check. And Europe and North America, the global north, so to speak, benefits from that. It's this border imperialism also that we really need to talk about. And the fact that it's a lucrative business to keep the way things are.
Yeah. It's when you look at all of these things, like the amount of money actually that is being spent on these, again, I'm probably speaking from a very naive perspective, but looking at the money, how much this is spent, and looking at the food that is being distributed in Malakasa camp, for example. And, like it's disheartening, obviously. It really breaks my heart, but I don't know. I'm just putting it out there as my frustration, I guess, because it's millions and millions, billions. I don't understand money, but like billions of euros, I guess, being spent, where people living in these camps are not giving access to hygiene. They are not giving access to proper, let alone proper nutrition. fresh food, like, that, like I'm leaving the, nutrition aside. They are giving like food that is actually like not even, edible, old, and, leftovers basically.
For
So
sure. We've seen, pictures or videos of insects, for example, being in the food that's being distributed. I mean, it's horrific conditions. And absolutely, I mean, I think this is a really important point, and it's one that you are immediately faced with when you are inside these camps, when you see all the, shiny new doors and turnstiles and tech and drones and wire and all of that. I mean, all that money that is being used towards violent border regimes could be used towards education or retraining or trauma counseling or food or water. I mean, for me, one of the most crazy thing was when the Samos camp was being opened in September. A few weeks before it opened, it was confirmed that this kind of new system of surveillance called Centaur was going to be there, which includes all sorts of things: algorithmic motion detection, drones, the turnstiles that we mentioned, the fingerprinting. And yet the camp didn't have running water at that time.
of course,
You don't really get clearer prioritization than that. It's really, really obvious where the money is being spent, and it's really, really disheartening. And again, I mean, it's one thing to critique it from, the Greek perspective or the Italian perspective, or looking at these specific contexts. But again, I think it's really, really important to underline that this is a European decision. This is European money and European policymakers who are choosing to allocate vast amounts of resources for these new camps, for this new surveillance, for this new AI that's being used, rather than thinking about what other ways that this money could be used for. And again, why are we not talking to affected communities or human rights lawyers or civil society? I mean, anyone working in this space will come up with 20 different ways that this money could be repurposed, right?
Yeah, exactly. And the fact that this is actually, one of the things that I keep repeating in this program, I think, is this is about the future and investing into the future. And European Union very consciously, in a very organized manner, spending its, or, allocating its budget to securitization, to militarization, to further exclusion of people on the move, to left to violence, basically. But majority of these people are going to be living in this European Union. They will stay here. And without any access to nutrition, without any access to education, without any access to any of the resources that are actually their fundamental rights. And so I feel like, in a sense, I always say this, that the EU is shooting at its own leg, basically.
For sure. I mean, it's such a short-sighted approach. I mean, we're failing entire generations of people. And this isn't just in Europe. I mean, if you look at the situation in East Africa, for example, and the Kakuma and Dadaab camps, where people have lived for generations now. I mean, really, it's such a short-sighted approach of really leaving entire swaths of the human population out of the ability to exercise not only their ability to come and claim asylum, but also to live a full life. It's really unfortunate that the European Union is taking this approach, right? Because it really could be benefiting so much from a really diverse population with an incredible set of skills. I mean, the people that I meet with, particularly people coming from Syria, but also other parts of the world, very, very highly skilled, different types of professions represented. It's not even about that, though. It's about giving people the ability to live a full life and really kind of tap into their human potential. And Europe is consistently choosing to not do that, to warehouse people in camps, to separate families, to be more focused on deportations rather than thinking through what a fair asylum system could look like. And it's incredibly short-sighted too. I want to bring up the environmental kind of crisis as well, because obviously, if anything, more and more people will be crossing borders and on the move in the coming years. And what is really troubling for me is that if these are the kind of policies and decisions we're making today in 2021, almost 2022, what are we going to do in 5 years or 10 years when more people are fleeing environmental disasters that the West caused and is perpetuating actively? I mean, again, this is kind of obfuscation of responsibility that Europe, North America, other rich parts of the world don't want to have.
Yeah. And on top of it, I think, as we've seen again on the US-Mexico border, there's also the environmental impact of these constructions on the border areas within European territories as well. I mean, all these sensory or the wall imaginations that one of the biggest forests of the Europe, between Poland and Belarus, or on the islands, the complete, demarcation of these landscapes, to construct one, massive camp somewhere and then, go over another. It's just like, so it's the climate crisis is going to bring a different wave, they call the wave of migration, but also on the ground where these things are happening is also have environmental impacts, to add on to what you said, I think. Finally, I'm going to ask about your book. Obviously, it's coming in 2022 summer, I hope. I don't know.
We'll see. I have a lot to finish still, but yeah, that's the plan.
So to remind our audiences, the title is Artificial Borders, AI Surveillance, Border Tech Experiments. So besides my excitement about when can I have it in my hand, what does it cover? And then maybe we can finish with that.
And thanks for your excitement. That really will get me over the finish line. I mean, this is something I've been working on for many years now, and it's just a matter of pulling it all together. I mean, in the book, what I'm trying to do is for it to not be an academic text that's inaccessible and also expensive. It really, the idea for it is to stitch together the experiences and stories that I've been able to have at the border and kind of witnessing and seeing the rise of this surveillance kind of panopticon and these new border tech experiments, but really foregrounding the way that people on the move are experiencing this tech. One of the biggest privileges of my career and my way of working is that I spend a lot of time with people who really are part of, the communities that are at the forefront of some of these tech experiments. And what the book does is that it tries to link some of these vignettes and the stories that I'm really privileged to be able to hold and share with kind of an analysis of how the tech is shaped and changed across the world. So yeah, this is a great reminder for me to get back to writing. It's a hard process, especially during a pandemic. I feel like my brain is not quite as engaged as it could be, but the idea is to finish up some more on the ground work. We're going to the US-Mexico border and to East Africa next year, and I'm really in the final kind of phases of putting it together. So stay tuned, and I can't wait to get it into your hands as well. And mine. It'll be such a, I think, moment to actually hold the book. I don't know what that will feel like.
I am very excited and looking forward to it. I'm also looking forward to hopefully seeing you in the next year, as it's in a few in Athens, hopefully. I really thank you for participating here today, joining the program. Is there anything you want to add, or for final sentences?
Just really thank you for the opportunity to talk about this work. I mean, sometimes I think, especially given the way that the world is moving and the kind of really difficult news stories we all see every day, it's hard to find the kind of motivation to keep going. But it's conversations like this and knowing that people are interested in these issues and kind of wanting to learn with and from each other, it really helps a lot. So I really thank you for the opportunity to share a bit about my work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thanks to everyone who listened to us, watched us. I'll see you again in 2 weeks on The Move. Thank you for watching us, listening to us. Have a good Sunday and see you soon.
For meget men laver
Türkiye'nin sivil, bağımsız, özgür ve çoğulcu bir medya ortamına ihtiyacı var. Medyascope, 20 Ağustos 2015'te bu ihtiyacı karşılamak üzere yola çıktı. Ama yolumuz uzun. Bu yolculukta bize Patreon veya YouTube'un katıl butonu üzerinden katkıda bulunabilirsiniz. Destek verin, sizinle güçlenelim. Cumartesi ve pazar sizi kahveye bekliyoruz. Hafta sonu yazıları devam ediyor. Alpan Terek, Ayşe Çavdar, Aydın Selcan, Edgar Şar, Kemal Can, Rolf Giresun, Ruşen Çakır, Seren Selvin Korkmaz, Sevilay Çelenk ve Ülkü Doğanay sadece videolarıyla değil, kalemleriyle de karşınızda. Hafta sonu yazıları her cumartesi ve pazar medyascope.tv'de.